At 20 below zero, Clara Voss's house had the smallest fire on the road. It also had the smallest rooms. That was what made the neighbors laugh in October. When Clara began building new walls inside a perfectly usable farmhouse, shrinking every room by nearly 3 feet on every side. By January, when water pails were freezing beside other family stoves, nobody was laughing. The strange part was not that Clara had found a way to burn less wood. The strange part was that she had learned the trick from keeping ice frozen in July. Eastern Nebraska, autumn of 1894. The prairie around Cedar Creek had been cut down to stubble. Corn stood in shocks along the fields. The cottonwoods had gone yellow, and every cold morning carried the warning of what was coming. Most families were preparing in familiar ways. They repaired chinking, stacked split wood, stuffed rags around window frames, and made sure the stovepipe was sound. Clara Voss was doing something that looked backward. Her house was a plain 1.5-story frame building, 22 feet by 28, set on a low stone foundation. It had been built quickly 3 years earlier after she and her husband bought the claim from a man moving west. The boards were decent. The roof held. The windows rattled, but no more than anyone else's. Since her husband's death the previous spring, Clara had run the place with her 17-year-old son, Paul, and her 13-year-old daughter, Anna. She kept 2 milk cows, a team, a kitchen garden, and enough acres in corn and oats to keep the note from swallowing the farm. She did not have money to waste, which was exactly why her neighbors could not understand what she was doing. Clara carried lengths of rough 1x4 pine into the front room and nailed them to a new row of upright posts set well inside the exterior walls. Then she did the same in the kitchen, then the bedroom. Within days, each room began to acquire a second wall, not outside the house. Inside it, a 3-foot-wide passage slowly formed between the old outer wall and the new inner one. The windows now sat at the end of deep wooden tunnels. The rooms that had once felt modest began to feel cramped. Paul stood in the kitchen doorway, measuring the new dimensions with his eyes. "Ma, we're losing half the house." "We're losing floor," Clara said. "Not the house." At the general store, the project became an easy joke. A widowed woman with a mortgage was spending lumber to make her home smaller before winter. Henry Talbot, the local carpenter, was the most offended by it. He had repaired half the farmhouses around Cedar Creek and had spent 20 years learning what prairie weather did to bad work. When he stopped by to sharpen a plain iron for Paul, he studied the new interior frame in silence. "You know walls don't make heat," he finally said. Clara kept sorting short boards by length. "Neither does a blanket." Talbot frowned. "A blanket goes around the body. You're putting one room inside another." "That's the idea." He looked toward the windows, now recessed nearly an arm's length beyond the unfinished inner wall. "And what are you filling that space with?" Clara pointed to the wagon outside. It was piled high with chopped cornstalks, oat straw, and the cleanest dry chaff she had been able to barter from a threshing crew. Talbot's expression changed from skepticism to alarm. "You're stuffing crop trash into the walls?" "Dry crop trash. That's mice, mold, and fire." This time, Clara stopped working. "If it gets wet, yes. If it touches the stovepipe, yes. If I leave gaps for mice, yes. That's why we're not doing any of those things." That answer did not make the project look less absurd. It only made it clear that Clara intended to finish it. Clara had not learned construction from a book. She had learned cold from work. Before she married, she spent 6 years at a creamery near La Crosse. Wisconsin. In winter, the men cut blocks of river ice, hauled them into an ice house, and buried the stacks in dry sawdust. By midsummer, when the air outside shimmered above 90 degrees, the center of that building still held hard ice. The first year Clara worked there, she thought the sawdust was merely packing. Then she noticed the walls. The ice house had an outer shell, an inner lining, and a thick, dead space between them. The sawdust did not make cold. It slowed heat. The dry fibers trapped pockets of air, and the double wall reduced the drafts that otherwise carried warmth inward. Years later, on the Nebraska Prairie, Clara had seen the same principle from the opposite direction. In summer, insulation kept heat away from ice. In winter, it could keep heat from leaving a house. Her first winter on the claim had taught her how badly a thin frame wall failed at that job. A prairie wind did not simply make a house feel colder outside. It forced cold air through cracks, around window frames, under doors, and through every weak joint in the siding. Even where the wall itself was solid, moving air stripped heat from the exterior faster than still air would. Inside, the stove fought constantly to replace what the wind carried away. The family could make the iron stove hot enough to redden its seams, yet the far corners of the room remained cold. A chair placed near the wall felt as though it had been stored outdoors. Frost grew on nail heads. A cup of water left on the bedroom washstand could skin over with ice before dawn. The natural response was to burn more wood. But wood was labor before it was heat. Every extra armload had to be cut, split, hauled, stacked, kept dry, carried inside, and fed into the stove. A household could survive the cold and still lose the winter to the work required to fight it. After her husband died, Clara began calculating that labor differently. Paul could cut wood, but every day he spent at the woodlot was a day he was not tending livestock, hauling feed, repairing harness, or finishing the grain work. Clara could split and carry too, but there were only so many hours in the winter light. She did not need a hotter stove. She needed a house that stopped spending heat so quickly. Her plan had one severe disadvantage. It sacrificed space. The new inner shell reduced the width of the front room by nearly 6 feet. The bedroom became tight enough that the bed had to be turned. The kitchen table moved closer to the stove. But the sacrifice created something the original house did not have: depth. Between the cold exterior siding and the new inner wall was a broad insulated buffer. Clara and Paul fitted tarred building paper behind sections most exposed to wind. They sealed obvious cracks around the old siding from the inside. They boxed the window tunnels carefully and left small access panels where they could later inspect the fill. Around the stovepipe, Clara refused to use plant fiber at all. Talbot's warning about fire had been correct. She kept the combustible fill well away from the flue and built a mineral and sheet metal clearance zone around it. The rest of the cavity was filled in layers: dry straw first, then chopped cornstalk fiber, then more straw, tamped enough to prevent large air channels but not crushed into a solid mass. Clara had no instrument that could tell her the thermal resistance of the wall. She could not have named an R value. She did understand 3 practical rules: keep the material dry, break up moving air, and make the path for heat as slow and difficult as possible. Those rules were enough. By the second week of November, the farmhouse looked almost normal from the road. That was another difference between Clara's project and the kind of construction people expected to recognize. Nothing dramatic had appeared outside. No second roof, no strange tower, no new wing. The oddity was hidden within. Visitors opened the front door and discovered that the familiar room had become a box inside a box. The window sills were now deep enough for Anna to sit on. The outer doors opened into short, cold vestibules before another door admitted anyone to the warm rooms. Shelves had been built into a few of the wall cavities. The house felt denser, quieter, almost ship-like. Talbot came back once more before the weather turned hard. He pushed his hand against the finished inner wall. "If this settles, you'll have cold pockets at the top. Then we open the panels and add more. If the straw takes moisture, it'll rot. Then we take it out. And if the mice get in..." Clara handed him a strip of tin flashing she was fitting along a lower seam. "Then Anna's cat finally earns her milk." Talbot almost smiled. Almost. Then he glanced around the shrunken room. "Still think you've built yourself a very expensive closet." Clara nodded. "Then I hope it's a warm one." The first real cold arrived in December. Not a blizzard. Not yet. Just 3 nights with a hard northwest wind and temperatures low enough to make iron handles sting bare skin. Clara did not celebrate early. She watched. She burned the stove as she normally would at supper, then let it settle to a small, steady fire. Before bed, she placed 3 ordinary objects in different parts of the house: a crock of milk near the north inner wall, a basin of water in the bedroom, and a small butter dish on the kitchen shelf farthest from the stove. The experiment was crude, but it answered the question that mattered. In the old house, the north wall had been the worst place to leave anything overnight. At dawn, Clara checked the basin first. No ice. The milk was cold but liquid. The butter was firm, not frozen. More important, the rooms no longer had the violent temperature difference they once did. The stove area was warm, but the corners were no longer punishingly cold. The walls did not radiate the same deep chill. Paul noticed something else. The fire had lasted, not because it burned longer, but because the house demanded less from it. They began keeping a rough tally of wood use by stacking each day's fuel separately in the shed. The comparison was not scientific. Weather varied, wood species varied, stoves varied. But by the end of the month, the pattern was obvious enough for a family ledger. They were carrying far fewer armloads inside. Then the wall gave Clara her first warning. One morning after a sharp temperature drop, Anna noticed a thin white line of frost along the upper edge of the north window tunnel. It was not much, but it did not belong there. The wall below it felt mild. The strip above it felt distinctly colder. Paul thought the window itself was failing. Clara climbed onto a chair and opened the nearest inspection panel. When she reached upward into the cavity, her fingers found what Talbot had predicted. The first weeks of vibration and settling had lowered the loose fill enough to leave a shallow open space near the top. That gap mattered, because the cavity was no longer behaving as one deep blanket. Air had room to move. Warm air from the inner side could rise into the empty channel, cool against the outer shell, and sink again. The wall had created a small convective loop exactly where Clara wanted stillness. The flaw was useful because it appeared before the hardest weather. She and Paul opened the upper panels along the north and west sides, added dry material, and tamped it just enough to remove the channels without crushing the fibers into a dense block. Then Clara found another problem. A narrow crack where the old siding met a window frame was admitting a faint stream of outside air. She sealed that path too. The repair took most of a day. It also changed the way she thought about the wall. The insulation was not one thing. It was several conditions working together. Depth without air control could still leak heat. Fibers without dryness could fail. A deep cavity with an empty channel could allow air to circulate inside it, and every window, door, flue, and seam remained a possible shortcut around the system. That evening, Clara wrote more than a fuel tally in the ledger. North upper wall settled, refilled, window seam sealed. Check again after hard wind. It was the closest thing the house had to an operating manual. 2 nights later, the same strip stayed clear of frost. Clara did not take that as proof that the entire design had succeeded. It only meant one specific weakness had been found and corrected. The real test would come when the wind stayed hard long enough to pull at every joint for days. Clara's mortgage had not shrunk. Her chores had not disappeared. The winter had not become easy, but one of the largest daily demands on the household had changed. They were no longer feeding the stove as though it were a second animal. Then January tested the house for real. A dry, cold front dropped across the plains and stayed. For 2 days the wind pushed loose snow sideways across the open fields. Drifts formed behind fences and along the south sides of barns. Hinges stiffened. Pump handles froze. Livestock had to be watered in short shifts because exposed skin became painful within minutes. The cold found every weakness in Cedar Creek. At the Talbot house, Henry burned through the stack beside his back door and started pulling from the reserve pile earlier than he expected. At the Kruger place, a draft under the kitchen door froze the edge of a wet rag to the floorboards. The small schoolhouse closed when the teacher could no longer keep the room warm enough for children seated away from the stove. On the second evening of the cold spell, Henry Talbot made the mistake that finally changed his opinion. He stayed too long at the Kruger farm repairing a broken feed sled tongue. By the time he started home, snow was blowing hard enough to erase the road edges. His mare fought the wind for nearly a mile before a harness buckle tore loose. Talbot climbed down to repair it. The leather was stiff. His fingers were worse. He managed a temporary knot, but within another quarter-mile, the fastening failed again. Clara's farm was closer than his own. So the carpenter who had mocked her smaller rooms turned his mare toward the house he had called an expensive closet. The first thing he noticed was the entry. Clara had converted the old front doorway into a 2-stage passage. Talbot stepped through the outer door into a narrow, unheated vestibule, shut the wind behind him, then opened the inner door. He expected the familiar wave of overheated stove air. It did not come. The room was simply warm, not scorching near the stove and freezing beyond it. Warm. Paul sat at the table, repairing harness. Anna was reading. Clara was kneading bread dough near the north side of the kitchen, nowhere near the fire. The stove door was closed. No one was feeding it. Talbot stood inside with snow melting from his coat and looked toward the wood box. It held 6 pieces of split ash. "Where's the rest?" he asked. Paul looked up. "In the shed. You mean for tonight?" "That is for tonight." Talbot said nothing. Clara handed him a towel and told him to sit down while Paul went outside to help with the mare. As feeling returned to his hands, Talbot began doing what craftsmen do when a result contradicts expectation. He inspected. He checked the inner wall. He held his palm near the window tunnel. He opened the access panel Clara had built near the northwest corner and pushed his fingers into the dry fill. The outer side of the cavity was bitterly cold. The inner side was noticeably milder. There was no magical line where cold stopped. There was simply a deep layer through which heat moved slowly, while the building paper sealed joints and two-stage entry reduced the air leakage that had once carried heat away. Talbot closed the panel. "How much space did you lose?" "Too much," Clara said. "How much straw?" "More than I wanted to haul." "Any dampness?" "Not yet. I check after every warm spell." He glanced toward the stovepipe. "Clearance? More than you told me." That finally produced a small laugh. But his face changed again when Anna brought out the wood tally. The pages were simple. Dates, weather notes, number of armloads. Nothing in the ledger could prove how Clara's wall would perform in another house. It did not account for every variable. It was not a laboratory test. But it documented a change in this house, under this family's conditions, large enough that the labor difference was impossible to miss. Talbot turned 2 pages back. "You ought to have me look at the roof line in spring," he said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "To tear it out, to keep it dry. If you're going to do a foolish thing, you should at least make it last." That was as close to an apology as Henry Talbot gave anyone. Word moved through Cedar Creek, but not the way Clara expected. People did not rush home and build 3-foot inner walls. Most could not afford to lose that much floor space. Some houses had rooms too small to begin with. Others had moisture problems, leaky roofs, unsafe flues, or rodent issues that made loose plant fiber fill a bad choice. Talbot himself warned people not to copy the method blindly. That limitation mattered. Clara's house worked because the wall was deep. The fill stayed dry. The worst air leaks had been addressed. The stovepipe was isolated from combustible material, and the family accepted a smaller living area in exchange for lower heat loss. The lesson was not that cornstalks were magic. The lesson was that the house had been treated as a system. Wind control mattered, air leakage mattered, material dryness mattered, insulation depth mattered, fire safety mattered. And the cheapest heat was the heat the house did not force them to replace. Talbot began changing his own work in smaller ways. When he repaired siding, he paid more attention to air paths behind it. He built tighter vestibules on 2 farmhouses. On a new addition for the Krugers, he used a double-stud arrangement that allowed a deeper insulated cavity without stealing as much interior floor space. The exact materials changed from job to job. The principle did not. That spring, Clara opened the inspection panels. Most of the fill was still dry. In one corner beneath a window, however, she found a patch beginning to clump from moisture. The problem had not defeated the idea. It had exposed the cost of it. She and Paul removed the damp material, repaired the leaking window flashing, and replaced the fill. That small repair became as important as the winter success. It proved the system needed maintenance. A thick wall could slow heat and still fail if water entered it. A low-tech solution was not the same as a careless one. By the next winter, Clara's house no longer felt strange to the people who visited it. It felt compact. The deep window tunnels held jars, sewing baskets, and Anna's school books. Paul had built narrow cupboards into 2 of the inner walls. The cold vestibule stored boots and feed sacks. What had looked like wasted space became part insulation, part storage, part buffer between the family and the weather. The mortgage was still there. The farm still demanded work. Storms still shut the road. But the woodpile had stopped governing every winter day. That was the real change. Clara had not defeated the prairie cold by making more heat. She had reduced the number of places where heat could escape quickly. The idea was older than her farmhouse and simpler than the language later engineers would use to explain it. Icehouses, cold storage rooms, barns, double walls, packed fibers, dead air spaces, all had relied on versions of the same physical truth. Heat moves toward cold. Moving air speeds the exchange. Dry trapped air slows it. The details matter enormously. Straw and chaff can burn. They can hold moisture. They can shelter pests. Modern insulation systems solve many of those problems with materials and assemblies designed for fire control, vapor management, air sealing, and code compliance. Clara's improvised wall was not a blueprint for a modern house. It was a frontier answer to a frontier constraint. She had little cash, abundant crop residue, a labor problem, and a building that leaked heat faster than her household could comfortably replace it. So she did the one thing that seemed foolish only if floor space was more valuable than winter labor. She made the house smaller, and in doing so, she made the winter smaller too. Years later, when Henry Talbot described Clara's house to a younger carpenter, he did not mention the jokes at the store or the night his harness failed. He pointed to the thickness of the wall with two spread hands and said only this: "She stopped heating the wind."